Life on the lake has been a peaceful and serene experience for generations who revel in their slice of Louisiana's sportsman's paradise. Whether it's fishing, crabbing, shrimping, or other activities, those living in parishes bordering Lake Maurepas think of the lake not only as their livelihood and way of life, but as a close member of the family as well. Yet Lake Maurepas, like other water and land bodies in South Louisiana, has been no stranger to natural disasters. In recent decades, hurricanes, floods, rising sea levels, and heat waves have become more and more severe, reaching epic levels that lead to greater devastation. Geologists say that it will only get worse as the disasters grow in frequency and intensity, and life in Louisiana gets wetter, hotter, and more humid than ever before. The cause of this climate change is global warming, and Louisiana is just an example of what's happening around the world. This climate warming takes place when greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide from energy plants are emitted into the atmosphere, blanketing the earth and trapping the sun's heat. Louisiana temperatures have increased by 4% in the last 20 years, and they're expected to rise to 6% by the year 2050. Not only changing weather patterns, but also disrupting the balance of nature with risks for humans and other forms of life.
The earth is getting hotter, and hotter is also drier. And so everything that goes into the atmosphere affects every creature on this planet. And so it's becoming more of an issue every year. You see, we get more droughts now, we get heavier rains. And so in Louisiana, we don't really think it's going to get wetter or drier, but we know we're going to have bigger hurricanes, and we know we're going to have a hell of a lot more flooding and also a lot more droughts. And so the weather here is going to become more variable the more carbon that gets into the sky.
The main culprit for this deadly climate change is carbon dioxide, which makes up 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions, mainly from fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas used to generate electricity and power. As a result, world leaders have banded together to promote, legislate, and fund clean energy initiatives for energy companies. The goal is to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by the year 2050. One booming clean energy process backed by governments is carbon capture and sequestration. This involves capturing and transporting carbon-based industrial byproducts through a pipeline for later injection beneath the Earth's surface, preventing the release of these substances escaping into the Earth's atmosphere.
We can lower the footprint of carbon, reduce the emissions, not continue to contribute to global warming, which overall is important for all of us, especially a coastal state. Rising seas, severe weather affects all of us. So overall, focusing on what carbon sequestration is for, meeting and exceeding those goals that we need to hit in 2050.
My commitment to this issue has been unwavering. Today, finally, thanks to the actions we've taken, I can stand here as President of the United States of America and say with confidence, the United States of America will meet our emissions targets by 2030.
The government has earmarked $251 million to support 12 projects across 7 states that will bolster the nation's ability to manage carbon. This funding, along with $2.25 billion from the Department of Energy, supports the expansion and development of carbon capture and sequestration programs. There are currently 30 carbon capture projects going on around the globe.
Obviously, you're hearing about, from the federal standpoint, tax incentives for companies to take it seriously and to start figuring out ways to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. For Louisiana in particular, we are hearing roughly somewhere between $40 and $50 billion of investment in carbon sequestration projects.
This project represents a tremendously important step for our ongoing expansion into clean energy opportunities here in Louisiana.
Aligning with the company's commitment to generating a cleaner future for our world, Air Products has initiated a comprehensive $7 billion Louisiana-based carbon capture and sequestration project, expected to be one of the largest such projects in the world. At this facility, natural gas is the feedstock for making hydrogen, a valuable resource with many industrial applications. CO2 that comes from this process is captured and will be delivered via a 35-mile underground pipeline and injected 1 mile beneath Lake Maurepas for safe and permanent storage. This process, known as sequestration, significantly lowers the carbon footprint of the hydrogen, allowing for the production of clean hydrogen. The facility and pipeline are planned to become operational in 2028.
First, it's an investment. That will bring 170 permanent jobs that we will hire for our facility and our operation. Those jobs average $93,000 a year for a salary. It'll also create 2,000 construction jobs. Takes a long time and a lot of construction work to build a facility this large. We'll provide 30% of the revenues that are paid to the state. That 30% of those revenues would go back to the parishes of the lake. Air Products has created a Lake Maurepas fund. That fund is $1 million a year for the life of our project of 25 years. That fund will be working directly with the communities for improvement projects around the lakes, or not just for the health of the lake, but also for the enjoyment of Lake Maurepas.
Air Products, known as the world leader in hydrogen technologies, already has been established in Louisiana for over 5 decades, with 330 employees at 18 existing facilities located throughout the state. These units manufacture hydrogen and other gases for oil refineries and petrochemical plants along the Gulf Coast. The proposed blue hydrogen plant in Ascension Parish will have the innovative ability to directly capture and pipeline CO2 safely to a state-owned underground pore space 1 mile beneath the Lake Maurepas area for immediate and permanent underground storage. And long pipelines are nothing new for Air Products. It already operates the world's largest hydrogen pipeline, which runs 700 miles from New Orleans to South Texas. There are over 50 petrochemical and refining companies utilizing the pipeline.
So being able to have a facility that can produce blue hydrogen that flows through our 700 miles of pipeline also allows other companies to reduce their carbon footprint because they need hydrogen to be able to make whatever they are making. With blue hydrogen, they immediately get the benefits of lowering the carbon footprint.
The Louisiana Clean Energy Complex with CO2 sequestration 1 mile beneath Lake Maurepas will be Air Products' largest investment of this type in North America, one that also involves safely storing and monitoring CO2 1 mile beneath the surface. Air Products has maintained another carbon capture project for over a decade in South Texas.
Sequestration is the final end of the whole process, and that's where we take CO2 and permanently lock it into the geology underground via a few layers. One is called a reservoir or a saline aquifer, and which is porous and permeable. The layers on top of that have to be impermeable and they have no porosity so that CO2 can't travel up through the rocks. That CO2, it goes in, again, it has to be, any project in the world has to be at least 2,500 feet deep, so that the CO2 stays what's called supercritical. Ours will be closer to 1 mile deep under Lake Maurepas. So Louisiana, and actually much of the Gulf Coast, but especially Louisiana, has really great geology for this. And we know that through the oil and gas industry, because that is what's made oil and gas so successful for over 100 years, is that those geologic layers are fantastic for keeping fluids in the subsurface. Once we're always looking for oil in that, here we're looking to use it as the same sorts of layers will keep CO2 from coming to the surface, just like they keep oil from coming to the surface. So we know that through this long history of oil and gas production that Louisiana's should be fantastic, particularly where many of us are looking in South Louisiana, which has very similar geologic environment across the state. So it has those layers of injectable reservoir zones covered by impermeable caprock layers.
In addition to its geology, Lake Maurepas was chosen because it has few pre-existing oil or gas wells.
but they're really concentrated on one side of the lake. So there's a large open area where there is no oil and gas wells, which might become a potential leak point, though we do have to fix many of them up if they were to become one. It also has very few faults. There are faults, but there's very few of them in Lake Maurepas, and we are investigating that with our 3D seismic survey. And so due to those factors, there are very few leak points under Lake Maurepas for CO2 to go through. Again, it doesn't have many wells, whereas the Gulf of Mexico, is anyone who's worked in oil and gas in Louisiana knows, is a prolific amount of wells. The Gulf of Mexico also has a lot of salt domes, and we are looking to avoid salt domes because they potentially can become leak points. Lake Maurepas does not have those salt domes. There's none within about 10 miles of the project area, so it is a very geologically quiet area that makes it a really great sequestration point.
Yet the fear of a carbon dioxide leakage, which could ruin Lake Maurepas, its ecosystem, and their very way of life, is shared by some residents of Tangipahoa, Livingston, and St. John parishes, which border the lake.
So Lake Maurepas is valuable in a lot of different ways. Obviously, it's very important from an economic perspective to the commercial fishermen there. Historically, Lake Maurepas has had a very substantial blue catfish fishery. It is also a shrimp sanctuary, and it is also heavily fished from a blue crab perspective. So there are economic value that the lake can provide to the region.
On the one hand, we have this proposed method to reduce our anthropogenic impact on the climate. On the other hand, from a more local perspective, we have that mitigation technique directly affecting a very small area where we all live and care about.
In addition, it's obviously recreationally important. There are poker runs that occur there. People like to just recreationally fish there. Those are also very beneficial in a lot of different ways.
The public obviously is going to have the hair on the back of their neck stand up when they hear about a project like this. And I feel the same, right? Here we have a situation in which there's a lot of unknowns. So the public has every right and every opportunity to kind of think about this as, what are the potential negative impacts? How is this going to affect where I live, my resources, where I go out and spend my occupational time or my recreational time?
Let's face it, there's South Louisiana has a long history of having bad environmental stuff done to it. I mean, a long, long history. And of governments and companies saying, oh, it'll be fine, and guess what? It's not fine. And the people and the area, the environment ends up paying for it. And when in South Louisiana, when the environment's impacted, people are impacted. And we are very, very closely related to the environmental, health of this area here.
Although carbon sequestration is not a new technology, it's new for people here. They really don't know what it is. They don't understand it. Through our community meetings, going through our permitting processes thus far, we've had a lot of community concern, a lot of questions about what carbon sequestration is, how is that going to affect the environment, how is that going to affect the lake. Most of the concern that we have heard from the residents around the lake is, well, what happens with the water table, right? So what we're trying to explain to them, that carbon sequestration is done way below the water table of what their drinking water would be, because it's governed by the EPA, below a cap rock, which cannot get to the water table.
So you have to realize that the CO2 is over a mile underground. The drinking water aquifer is right at the top, and there's a thick layer of over 1,000 feet of that cap rock in between. So where the CO2 is being injected is really far below the aquifer at the top, and you have to constantly be monitoring. We will be monitoring 24/7, 365 from before the project starts until 50 years after we stop injecting, to make sure that CO2 has never left the reservoir interval in which it has been injected. We've taken samples before, there's no CO2 there, and where we've placed them, we never expect CO2. So we constantly do that. If any CO2 shows up, that means we shut down the system. We also would have to shut down if CO2 in any part of the monitoring system comes where it wasn't expected. That's actually federally mandated. You stop injecting until you figure out what just happened.
In order to begin drilling the injection well, Air Products must receive a mandated Class 6 injection permit from the state of Louisiana. Air Products is currently operating with a Class 5 permit, which allowed seismic testing and the drilling of a test well, which is required to gather information for the Class 6 permitting process. Preliminary activities also include obtaining core samples from specific layers beneath the lake, revealing depth thickness and pore spaces. A three-dimensional image from the seismic survey will reveal the best location for drilling.
The 3D seismic survey allows us to see basically what's under the lake in 3 dimensions. And so that allows us to understand the CO2 is going in here, but we know it's going to spread out a little bit over a mile underground. That allows us to know where are the reservoir intervals, where are the confining zones, where are any faults, things like that, so we can avoid leak points like faults, so we know where spatially, again, and vertically, everything is in the subsurface. It includes drilling a stratigraphic test well, so you understand in tiny detail, like it's like basically smaller than an inch, and over a depth of over 9,000 feet, exactly what that rock looks like. You have to tie them together to make sure you understand what your rocks are doing. You have to collect core samples and send them off to the lab to have them tested to make sure you understand how well they can inject or hold back CO2 depending on the rock type, and that can take several years.
Air Products will apply for an advanced Class 6 permit following extensive research at the Class 5 designation, which should prove the safety of the intended drilling location. In the meantime, scientists from Southeastern Louisiana University are monitoring the health of the lake and its ecosystem for the duration of the project. This 3-year project was initiated in 2023 via a 3-year contract with Air Products guaranteeing financial and logistical support.
One of the things that we are doing is we're working with Southeastern. Southeastern is monitoring the lake for us so that we get a baseline of what the lake environment ecosystem is. And that will be, the lake will be monitored throughout the project to make sure that we're not affecting the ecosystem of the lake.
They are the experts in Lake Maurepas and the shallow water ecology. It's so important to us to make sure that the experts on the lake are the ones who are helping us with that safety monitoring program so that we understand the ecology of the lake from long before we start injecting all through the life of this project.
Lake Maurepas is ours too in that sense. Like this is, part of our area here. So we treat it as, we care about it a lot. It's very important to us. It's important to the university. All of our researchers, they spent their careers studying that Lake Pontchartrain, Lake Maurepas area. So they've kind of built their careers up for it. So we're very, very concerned about the health of the whole lake, and the fact that we have this opportunity to monitor it and study it is a wonderful opportunity, and we're excited to move forward with it.
The Southeastern monitoring team is currently winding up year 2 of a preliminary 3-year term of sampling and analysis to supply a baseline of data showing the normal biological and chemical levels for living organisms in and around the lake. Efforts that are in addition to extensive safety and amelioration efforts conducted by Air Products. The lead scientist for Southeastern is biology professor Kyle Pillar.
Right now, we are contracted for a 3-year monitoring project where we monitor the aquatic environment and the organisms in it. We monitor the wetlands in the area around the lake. We will monitor the chemical composition in the water column, and we will conduct some education and outreach. Sort of the 4 components of this project. We wanted to be involved to serve as the independent monitors for this project. Obviously, this lake is in our backyard. We have the expertise to work there, and we felt that it was good for us to be involved as long as we were allowed to remain independent. And fortunately, Air Products has allowed us to remain independent biological monitors of this project, and that's why we're involved.
Being an independent monitor is critical to maintaining public trust, according to Pillar.
We have the ability to control the data. We own the data. We're going to make the data publicly available on a website so that anybody in the public can log in and look at, let's say, the dissolved oxygen concentration in the lake, the temperature of the lake, the pH, any of those parameters, as well as the biological data that we'll be collecting over the next 3 years. So it's really important to remain independent.
Pillar says that baseline data collected over the next 3 years will provide information on the current situation of the lake as a reference point for any future disturbances.
Then, when the carbon sequestration injection project actually begins, we will have the baseline data to know if there are any impacts that result from their activities, whether it's the construction of the wells, whether it's the actual carbon sequestration injection. Any of those events could be impactful to the biological community and the abiotic components of Lake Maurepas, and we have that ability to report violations to the appropriate entities that have regulatory authority. But again, it gives us the ability to say what we want to say about what's going on and truly assess the situation.
The monitor team members collaborate on a regular basis to share critical information and make decisions to determine the different locations on the lake to place buoys which will gather real-time data of carbon dioxide, dissolved oxygen, temperature, and other measurements in the lake.
If you want to capture all the variability, I would move this one to here because that's going to capture salt water. This one I moved down to here, that's your lake, another lake. So these are both really lakes because Passman check doesn't usually.
The Southeastern team members in their areas of monitoring are Pillar with the aquatic realm, Chris Murray with the physiology of organisms like alligators, Gary Schaefer with the wetlands, and Fareshta Imami with the chemical makeup of the lake's water column. For centuries, Lake Maurepas has been known for its rich population of fish and other aquatic life. Monitoring this realm will be Kyle Pillar, an ichthyologist in Southeastern's biology department. Pillar is also curator of the university's Vertebrate Museum, which houses 120,000 specimens.
Interesting enough, we know a lot about the Gulf of Mexico. We know a lot about the community, the organismal communities and the abiotic conditions in Lake Pontchartrain. We don't know a lot about Lake Maurepas. There simply isn't a lot of historical data. It's kind of the forgotten stepchild lake in that whole west to east gradient from Maurepas out to the Gulf of Mexico. Pontchartrain, we know a lot. Maurepas, we really don't.
That's a narrative that Pillar plans to change. In Lake Maurepas, he's sampling and analyzing fish, crab, shrimp, and Rangia clam populations. Pillar uses gill netting, trawling, and electrofishing to scoop and sample a variety of fish species from different parts and depths of the lake.
We are gathering length and weight data for fish populations. These are standard metrics that have been used for decades to monitor the condition, the health of fish populations. It's used all over the world. What this can tell us is that there are substantial changes in length-weight relationships that are standardized across the globe.
423, salinity 0.32.
It can give us an indication that there may be something impactful going on. Maybe there's some toxins that are in the water column. Maybe CO2 is increasing. Maybe it impacts food web dynamics, and the fish aren't eating as much as they should because there's not as much of food items available. So this is sort of the baseline, simplest metric that we can gather, length, weight, to give us an idea of the condition of what's going on with the fishes and potentially if there's something going on before and after.
To this point, Pillar has encountered an abundance of blue catfish, the most economically important species in Lake Maurepas. Also, channel catfish, largemouth bass, spotted gar, menhaden, anchovies, sunfish, and freshwater drum or gaspergoo.
I will be doing something called environmental DNA monitoring, which is a technique where we go out and we sample water. As organisms are in the aquatic environment, they shed DNA, scales, mucus, feces, urine, that puts DNA out into the wild. We can capture that DNA in a water sample through filtration. We take those samples, those filters that have the DNA on them, and we use fish-specific primers or probes to amplify the fish DNA, simply based on the presence of the DNA they've left in the water column, their signatures. Then we can get a community list of the fish species that are at that particular site at that particular moment, simply based on the DNA they've left in the water column. So it's a nice complementary, very comprehensive approach to give us information on fish communities, what species are there. We're also going to be setting crab traps to monitor crab populations. We'll be trawling for shrimp populations, and we'll be using dredge grabs to capture Rangia clams that live in the sediment. You go out to Lake Maurepas on any given day and there are hundreds of crab traps set out there. But you try and get the historic data from the state agencies or from the feds, it doesn't exist. So we're going to be able to provide baseline data on population dynamics of blue crabs. How big are they? Male-female ratio, what's their growth rate, things of that nature. We simply don't know about Lake Maurepas. In addition, Lake Maurepas is a shrimp sanctuary, so nobody can shrimp there. What does that mean? We don't know anything about the shrimp populations in Lake Maurepas. So we're going to be able to gather that information on abundances of shrimp in Lake Maurepas, something we currently don't have. So these are examples of new data that we're going to be able to gather and analyze, make available to the public, and then hopefully publish in a scientific journal to make it available in literature forever. That's our goal, is to gather that baseline data that we simply don't have.
While Kyle Pillar monitors populations of aquatic life, Chris Murray, an ecotoxicologist, tracks toxins embedded in the tissues of Lake Maurepas organisms.
So we're studying crabs, frogs, catfish, and alligators. And the reason we're studying those four animals is because predominantly we're interested in how biochemical contaminants may affect all biota, living organisms, in particular animals in Lake Maurepas.
Murray takes blood samples of each of these organisms and analyzes them in the lab for a baseline of 28 variables.
So 3 of the main response variables that we're going to be utilizing or collecting data on across all 4 of our species are chronic stress, sex steroid quantification, and liver and reproductive organ histology. We don't know a lot about, for instance, chronic stress levels of these organisms in Lake Maurepas. Are they already being stressed out physiologically by something? We don't really know about their reproductive energy allocation. How many offspring are they having? Are they reproductively very healthy? We don't know what pathologies currently exist in the lake in these organisms. So I think that getting a really good handle on where we're at in the lake from an organismal health perspective is the only rational first step to be able to diagnose potential alterations of that health later on.
Murray's specialty is the physiological ecology of alligators and crocodiles. He's been featured on Discovery's Animal Planet and in both the Smithsonian and Science magazines for his research with crocodiles in Costa Rica. In 2020, he discovered a new species of crocodile in Papua New Guinea. Murray is currently focused on alligators in Lake Maurepas.
They're a great model organism for a number of things across the ecosystem because they are sort of at the top of the food chain, what we'd call an apex predator. Right? So all of the things that may be negatively affecting all of the smaller, lower levels of that food chain bioaccumulate in the apex predator. So we get a really clear, magnified picture of what might be affecting fish and crabs and everything else below alligators in that food chain when we target the apex predator.
Okay. All right. Hop in where I'm at and I'll take data. Just hold it down. Ready? Yep. Cover its eyes.
So we take blood from an alligator, for instance, and we smear it across a slide and stain these white blood cells so that we can utilize the microscope to count individual types of white blood cells. And when there becomes a problem, when we see that this alligator is chronically stressed, we'd see way more heterophils, for instance, one type of white blood cell, and way fewer lymphocytes. So when an organism is stressed, it tends to not produce as many lymphocytes, and heterophils, if we're talking about an alligator, will be more detectable because it will be releasing more of those into the bloodstream.
Murray will spin down the remaining blood to plasma in a centrifuge so he can examine sex steroids, blood pH, and estrogen or testosterone. He'll also explore alligator nesting habits on the lake to note reproductivity. Murray will capture fish and crabs with Kyle Pillar, and he'll draw blood for a lab analysis the same way.
For frogs, we're going to go out across the entire lake. We're going to go collect about 60 in the lake twice a year. We'll draw blood from the vast majority of them to do all the things that I've already mentioned, and a very small subset we will retain and dissect for our liver and reproductive organ histology. As a scientist, I aim to evaluate these data to be certain that negative impacts aren't occurring, and when they are, bring them to light as soon as possible so that we can mitigate these problems.
A healthy wetland environment is vital for organisms living in the Lake Maurepas ecosystem. Southeastern wetland ecologist Gary Schaefer is monitoring plants, trees, and soil in the Maurepas Swamp, the second largest coastal forest in Louisiana.
Lake Maurepas is extremely important to the region. It supports a tremendous amount of wildlife, and all you have to do is look at it really to see that support is going down essentially every day. About 87% of the swamp is dying right now.
Over the past century, a number of factors have caused this decline. Near permanent flooding, nutrient starvation, destructive nutria, saltwater intrusion, and subsidence, or the sinking of land beneath the 220 square mile swamp. Schaefer was at the forefront sounding this alarm 3 decades ago. Since then, he's championed reforestation by planting thousands of trees, suggested using municipal wastewater effluent in the swamp, and lobbied for the recently funded $14 million freshwater diversion of the Mississippi River into Lake Maurepas. Schaefer's current monitoring of the swamp is focused not only on potential impacts of carbon sequestration, but also the effectiveness of his restoration efforts.
So in order to know how well a restoration actually worked, how much swamp it actually benefited and how much it benefited it, you have to have baseline studies before the restoration is even begun, and that's what this is all about.
Critical areas of baseline data include canopy decay, along with tree growth of the water tupelo and bald cypress species.
So we're going to start with 8 sites, and they come in replicate. So that means we lay down 16 625 meters squared plots. Those are permanent plots. And every single tree in every one of those 16 plots gets a tag, so it has its own identification. Again, the most important monitoring you do with regard to a restoration is survivorship, which is real easy, right? You just count. You know how many stems are on the plot. Say there are 812 stems on the plot. You go out next year and you get 750. Well, guess what? Some seedlings died. So you want to see how stable your planting is.
Assessing the volume of leaves is also an indicator of swamp growth.
And then we also have litter fall traps, which are these boxes 1/4 meter squared that catch leaves falling out of the sky. So in most ecosystems, roughly half of the above ground productivity comes from the wood. So we take the leaves back to the lab and dump them out on a table, and then we have to sort them to species. And we only sort to 3 different entities. We have water tupelo, bald cypress, and what we call mid-story. So then you have to dry the material to get all the water out of it, and then we weigh it, and that is carbon. So half of the tissue in most any living organism is around 50% carbon. It's what supports ecosystems, right? So hardly anything eats wood, but ecosystems like even dead leaves, which are called detritus, are a huge part of the ecosystem when they enter an estuary. What supports the big fisheries in Louisiana is actually called the detrital food chain. So we're measuring the ecosystem response to whatever its environmental conditions are. So is it growing or not growing? And if it's growing, how much is it growing? And does it grow mostly from leaves or does it grow mostly from wood? Or is it 50-50 leaves and wood? All of this stuff is important with regard to deciding whether the restoration worked or not.
In addition, Schaefer and his team measure herbaceous plants and the bulk density of soil in the swamp. They survey sediment elevation to see if the swamp soil level is moving away from subsidence or sinking.
So if the elevation is indeed going up over time, then that translates into floodings going down over time, which is usually beneficial because most of Louisiana's wetlands are too flooded right now. So a sediment elevation table is a table, and it has holes in the top, and you drop pins down through the holes, and then you get the bottom of the pin with your fingers and you barely touch the soil, and then you measure the distance between the pin last year and the table and the pin this year and the table. And if the pin is longer, that means the soil went down, and if the pin is shorter, it means the soil came up. So one of those is accretion and the other one's subsidence, and they're both occurring all the time in every wetland ecosystem in coastal Louisiana. And our goal is to make sure that there's enough sediment gain to stay ahead of sea level rise.
Schaefer will also be planting trees to restore areas of swamp where tree survivorship has struggled. For sequestration to guard against tree-killing nutria, each tree planted will be protected by a nutria-resistant device.
So one of the things we're doing every year is planting 2,000 seedlings. So first time in 60 years, we're seeing seedlings jump out of the ground everywhere. We have 6-year-old saplings now that are 12 to 15 feet tall. It's just so wonderful to actually see that ecosystems in coastal Louisiana can be restored.
One aspect of Lake Maurepas that permeates all life in and around the lake is the chemical composition of the water. Southeastern analytical chemist Farishta Imami is monitoring the status of water quality as it currently exists in Lake Maurepas.
So the acidity and the temperature, the oxygen level, the nutrition level, and the other chemical compounds levels are very, very important for the water quality of the lake. And why the water quality of the lake is important? Because there are many other aquatic lives in there. We have wetlands, we have plants around, and we have many peoples that rely on this lake. Their lives are rely on this lake. So the quality of water is important.
Imami and her team are sampling the lake weekly to collect reference data for when carbon sequestration begins. She says that very little information on the lake's chemical makeup exists.
That is the reason we will closely monitor the water quality by sampling weekly from different depths of the lake. The lake has different depths, depends to which location you look into, but we will collect waters from the ground, from the surface, and in between. Having this data will help us to figure out what is going on in the lake. Is toxic chemicals are increasing? Are they decreasing? Is going to be any changes to their concentrations? Are we going to have new compounds or not?
3, 2, 1.
We'll have buoys in 4 locations of the lake, and that will help us to monitor carbon dioxide as well. So now when we monitor the pH, again, the concentration of the acid, that will help us to understand if any carbon dioxide got into the water. because perhaps it might change the acidity of the water.
Imami's team routinely obtains water and sediment specimens from testing areas within Lake Maurepas, as well as water samples from other undisturbed sites throughout the lake in order to determine if any dormant substances within the lake bed are circulated as a result of drilling activities.
Will those chemicals migrate toward different locations, like the identified non-dredging locations we made? Will they stay there, or will they go further toward the wetlands? So we will monitor them.
Imami will check potential migration by sampling in the swamp near Gary Schaefer's tree and sediment elevation research stations. In addition to scooping samples from both the surface and 15 feet down, Imami's team also collects sediment from the lake bed at 30 feet, examining the mud and turbidity caused by industrial activity that may impact life along the lake.
It will affect the oxygen level, it will affect the level of light that can get into the lake, which is very important for fish, for crabs, and for the plants.
After collecting samples from the lake and storing them in dry ice, the next step is analysis back at the chemistry lab. Of particular interest to Imami is the previous presence of any heavy metals already present within the waters of Lake Maurepas.
So one of the most important monitoring is looking into the heavy metal concentrations, figuring out what kind of heavy metals are there and how much. We will load the samples into the instrument. The instrument first will identify the type of heavy metals we might have in either the sediments or in water samples. Next, it helps us to figure their concentrations, how much of each are there.
Like the other Southeastern scientists, Imami will post her data on the website and share new information with her fellow researchers as well, all to monitor the potential impacts of carbon sequestration. The Southeastern monitoring team is now finishing up year one of collecting data from Lake Maurepas. At the end of 3 years, they will have compiled a comprehensive index of baseline data that can be referenced once drilling for carbon sequestration begins in January 2026, if Air Products has received the necessary Level 6 drilling permit. This baseline of knowledge will cover the current condition of the lake regarding aquatic life, physiology of its organisms, the wetlands, and chemical composition of the water. Since Southeastern will own the data, in the interest of transparency, all current and future data will be posted on the project website. This includes real-time data from the 4 buoys placed along the lake showing water temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, carbon dioxide, and turbidity. One of the buoys will serve as a weather station showing current atmospheric conditions. In addition to posting on its website, the project includes a community outreach component for educational purposes. This aspect features Southeastern biologist Rob Moreau, director of the university's Turtle Cove Environmental Research Station. Moreau has been conducting lectures, field trips, and boat tours for university classes, K-12 school groups, and community members for decades. He shares information about the lake and its ecosystem for up to 2,000 individuals per year.
Of course, from a wetland standpoint, which is what all of our researchers study and what we talk about in our education and outreach groups, is the fact that we continue to lose land in coastal Louisiana. We have sea level rise that's happening. We have subsidence of our wetlands. We have a lack of accretion, building up of the wetlands, which is how all of our land in southeast Louisiana was historically created, and those are obstacles that we're always going to have.
Moreau is now adding new information about monitoring activities of Southeastern scientists on the lake. The Lake Maurepas project also provides unique opportunities for students working with the Southeastern professors.
We're going to have probably like over 20 students working on this thing in all aspects of it. So it's a great educational aspect for them. They're going to get really good experience. So lots of students involved, lots of graduate students and undergraduate students. So they are very much a part of this.
Finally, even if the sequestration plan is approved, the team will continue to monitor conditions in the lake for the duration of the project. They will remain vigilant, reporting all data reflecting any changes to the lake once sequestration begins.
So our involvement in this project is really essential so that we can determine if there are impacts of any of their activities. Because in all honesty, we simply don't know whether there'll be any impacts at all. Our involvement is imperative to determine if that's the case or not.
Our job here at Southeastern, and my job in particular, is to maintain stewardship of the swamp, right? I'm a steward of the swamp. While we have no power in what happens, we certainly have the power in elucidating potential negative effects that may hopefully culminate in a change in the project, right? So our job is to protect our home in that sense, right? Our job is to elucidate potential negative impacts that this project has that may go unseen for a long time.
We want to know if there's things going on as a result of their activities. We want to be the stewards of the lake.